Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our live stream. Today's topic is BCDR, incident response in a multi-cloud environment. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Cloud Institute. And if you're not familiar with Cloud Institute, we're a training and coaching company that equips IT teams to confidently deliver on IT projects. We offer personalized coaching with cloud experts, with hands-on project-based training to help you with your live projects. And speaking of experts, I'm happy to introduce Adam Gordon, who will be presenting today. Adam is a advanced security practitioner, author, global speaker, educator, and executive with decades of IT experience and more IT certifications than anyone has time to mention. So let me bring up Adam here on the screen. Adam, hey, how you doing?
Hey, Peter, good to see you. I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to come back and hang out with you for a bit.
Yeah, definitely. And before I turn it over to you, Adam, I want to encourage you to, or everyone watching, to ask questions in the comments, and we'll be sure to answer them throughout the presentation. Also, this recording will be available here on the LinkedIn event page immediately afterwards, and we'll put it up on YouTube as well. We'll shoot for keeping it just around 30 minutes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Adam, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. So looking forward to spending some time chatting with all of you about BCDR incident response in multi-cloud environments. Many of you, I'm sure, are probably dealing with multi-cloud, or if not directly, maybe supporting customers that are, or maybe contemplating a move to a multi-cloud environment from a single cloud today, or perhaps even spreading wings out beyond the on-premises world and looking to see what your options are. Any and all of those are going to be important feeders that really bring us into the idea of talking about multi-cloud. When I spend time talking about multi-cloud environments with customers, with students, with decision makers, anywhere and everywhere I go in my travels, I always begin by defining what multi-cloud is. I find that we often take for granted in our industry that many people know things just because we're familiar with them, and we use that language all the time. And there are going to be conversations that are comfortable to have because everybody's on the same page, but occasionally there's one or two people in that conversation that may not know what we're talking about. So I always try to set the stage, right, and really define those concepts, those terms, those acronyms that we're all so familiar with, at least on the surface. And if you look on the screen as we're talking, a good working definition of multi-cloud is a strategy that involves using services from more than one public service provider, public cloud provider. Specifically, when we think of services, think of, and you can see some of the big names and perhaps very common names that many of us are familiar with in that space in the graphic. Azure, AWS, GCP is kind of off on the corner there. Alibaba, for those of you that are overseas in Asia, would certainly be a very common cloud provider as well. And the reality is that, as we're going to see in just a moment, and in the next couple of items that I put up on the screen, many companies are not only consuming, but consuming across more than one cloud platform today, and running very large percentages of their workloads in those clouds. Now, the strategic decisions about how to do that, why, and what the necessity, perhaps regulatory and statutory compliance is playing a part there. What those may be are beyond the scope of our conversation for today, with just a half hour to really look at this topic. But keep in mind that there are definitely going to need to be strategic and business objectives that we want to align the decision to move to a public cloud, specifically a multi-public cloud environment, against in any organization. It's not a bad place to find yourself offering services and consuming services, but it is a place that is fraught with risk. And we want to have a compelling reason to be there, and we want to have the right resources, thought processes, architecture, and risk awareness and change management capacity to drive that ability, but to do so in a risk-adverse and risk-focused, from a mitigation standpoint, manner. So really think of that as a theme as we begin our conversations here. All right, so let's define. We've defined what multi-cloud is. Let's define what the core element of our discussion topic is all about today. BCDR, an acronym many of us here, and I'm sure we have all used without necessarily thinking about defining it for someone. But business continuity and disaster recovery, it's an amalgamation of two acronyms that used to be very prevalent. We would talk about BCP, business continuity planning, DRP, disaster recovery planning. That kind of dates me a little bit, I suppose, in my longevity in our industry. You don't really tend to hear about BCP and DRP separately much anymore. We do still talk about them. We do still engage in the planning cycles around them, but we tend to just refer to BCDR to talk about those activities all up today. Sometimes also falls up under the rubric and the association of COOP, C-O-O-P, Continuity of Operations Planning, and BCDR is related to COOP in many respects. But BCDR is a set of approaches and or processes, as I talk about on the screen, that allow organizations to do two very important things. The BC portion, the business continuity portion, focuses on keeping the lights on in the face of adversity. We've been hit by malware. We don't want that to happen to anybody, but it's pretty common today. We've had some sort of weather event that perhaps has become disruptive and is interfering with our ability to have consistent power or internet service or things like that. Any of those things are disruptive. They can lead to disaster if we don't address them and mitigate them properly. But we can step up if we've done our planning and are proactive and have staged our resources effectively. And we can hopefully intercede, perhaps run with less than full service and full capabilities, but still keep the lights on and do business, even though it may be in a limited capacity for a period of time while we're thinking about and approaching the steps necessary to fully get back online. DR, disaster recovery, kicks in where, as a subset of business continuity, by the way, people don't often realize that business continuity and BC planning all up is the umbrella entity and the idea that we think of when we talk about BCDR. So disaster recovery is a subset. It's a set of activities up underneath and narrowly scoped as part of the broader conversation around BCDR. It's very important for all of you to be aware of that if you're not. And in DR, we're not focused on keeping the lights on. They've gone off and the roof is off the building, right? And everything is on fire. We're focused on getting away from that environment that has essentially become unusable, untenable. And we are focused on restoring, recovering, and regrouping our capability to offer services somewhere else, hopefully somewhere safe, whether that's an offsite alternate processing location, whether it's in the cloud, as opposed to perhaps a physical location, or perhaps a hybrid solution that involves both. That remains to be seen based on architecture. But we're focused there, and we're focused on ensuring that we can fail over, is a term you often hear, into that environment, and over time run our services there until we can restore normalcy at our primary location, however short or long that time period may be, and then fail back is what you often hear, where we move back to our original location at the end of that cycle as we have been able to safely establish and reestablish the ability to run our business there successfully. So starting from that position of having a good set of working definitions around multi-cloud and BCDR, hopefully that helps all of us to be on the same page. Let's just quickly look at a graphic that represents what I mentioned a moment ago about the real depth that we see with regards to public cloud providers and what kind of use we're seeing. Azure and AWS are always vying for that top spot. They go back and forth year over year. But you can see within a few percentage points, they're pretty close in terms of running significant workloads. Businesses are definitely investing in roughly a 2.5 to 1 ratio on those platforms versus GCP, and even more like 3 or 4 to 1, maybe even 5 to 1 as you look at some of the other outliers like Oracle, IBM, Alibaba, etc. So really we have a top 3 and then we have everybody else. And we're seeing growth, and this is from this year's Flexera State of the Cloud report. Relatively new and relatively timely and fresh data. Those percentages may have shifted 1% either way over the last few months since the report came out, but that's pretty accurate. And we see a significant amount of workloads not only staying in single cloud, but moving into multi-cloud environments, and that trend is continuing to escalate. We're seeing more and more of that year over year, just so you know. What are the design considerations and ultimately some of the recommendations that we need to spend some time on? This is where I'd like to spend the majority of our remaining time talking through this with you. I've put together several thoughts about design considerations. We'll start with those, we'll move to recommendations, and then we'll wrap up and leave some time for those questions that hopefully you guys are thinking about. In no particular order, but certainly all of them, I think, equally important as we consider how to approach BCDR and incident response in multi-cloud environments. Application and data availability requirements. We just talked about the fact that very large percentage of workloads, significant workloads, are migrating to the cloud, and multi-clouds And we have to think about what those workloads are, whether they can be run successfully, if so, how, under what conditions, through both RTO and RPO, as you can see on the screen. And support needs to be available, built into those platforms for active-active and active-passive availability patterns. If you're not familiar with those, definitely worth a follow-up or perhaps a question we can clarify for you. If you're not familiar with what RTO, recovery time objective, and RPO, recovery point objective are, do a little Google search. You can talk to Cloud Institute. They certainly can clarify as part of the work they do with working with professionals looking to learn more about cloud, about this and all of the things we'll talk about here. But you can certainly self-serve some of that information in preparation for perhaps consuming those services. RTO is all about how we're going to be able to set up a time value that's going to allow us to be able to understand how quickly and authoritatively we should be able to successfully bring a system back to functionality. And RPO, recovery point objective, is a measure of time that we should be able to recover our data against based on an outage, but it's an amount of data over an amount of time. And there's some subtlety and context to that conversation that we don't have enough time to go into in our discussion today, but I would encourage you to clarify those terms if you're not familiar with them as you're planning cycles around thinking through what multi-cloud BCDR may look like will be impacted severely if you're not familiar with these and don't understand how to manage them accordingly. There's been a move over the last couple of years to really look at BCDR services as a consumable service tied to, for instance, PaaS, platform as a service offerings, and many of the cloud vendors we talk about offer BCDR capabilities and services. The vagaries of naming and the product specificity by platform notwithstanding, they offer those services, whether it's a backup vault or a site recovery option or some combination of those things that are going to be available. They offer them with both native DR and high availability features built in. Geo-replication as well as DR capabilities for PaaS services are part of that offering as well, and are going to play an important part in how you think about not just providing a safety net for your workloads that are running, but providing a fully vested and fully vetted architecture that incorporates BCDR at its heart and thinks through the networking and the identity and access management and the service and provisioning capabilities that have to support that infrastructure as those workloads have to migrate and be brought back online in a different geography, in a different data center, wherever that may be, across the cloud fabric, or even failing between cloud providers, right? Because you can move within one cloud provider's data center architecture globally or regionally or locally as necessary. So Azure East to Azure West, but you can fail out of AWS into Azure as well as part of BCDR if you're running multi-cloud. The same conversation would extend to GCP, Oracle, VMware, Alibaba, etc. So it's important to think about those things, right, as part of the planning cycle. We go on and look at additional areas. Multi-regional deployment, as I just mentioned, of failover is going to be an important consideration. It is going to be a complicated architecture from a network and a services provisioning standpoint. If you try to do it on your own without some pre-thought and some guidance, the good news is the major cloud providers all have really good documentation. They have design patterns and they have centers of excellence that will allow you to be able to get guidance on this. All of that is freely available, by the way, through the cloud providers and their ecosystem. But again, you could look to vendors that provide these capabilities and services, whether in the consulting side or through training. Cloud Institute comes to mind. There are many other areas and vendors you can focus on. But certainly whoever you reach out to, you want to make sure you have a plan and you have the certified professionals and the skill sets necessary to execute the plan. I'm a big fan, by the way, of home growing your talent and growing your teams to rise to these challenges. But I am also a realist. I understand that that might not be possible for every business, especially smaller businesses. And there's no shame at all in asking for help and getting professional guidance that will allow you to make informed, risk-averse decisions that position you for success. And if anybody tells you differently, find new friends to talk to because they're giving you bad advice. Application operations with reduced functionality or degraded performance, we have to account for those, right? There are going to be hits to our SLAs potentially, our uptime and our availability. Remember, BC is all about keeping the lights on, even though we may have diminished capacity. And we want to try to stay in the BC realm. If we move into DR, we've done some things and it hasn't worked. we have a major, major issue on our hands. It's not just some impact to some applications, it's everything is down, and we've got to start over, and that's going to be significantly more problematic. So we really have to understand where those workloads may be that are going to be primary. We have to facilitate an assessment of them through a BIA, a business impact analysis, again, an acronym and a process you may or may not be familiar with. And we need to ensure that the outcome of those decisions and those prioritizations around those workloads is communicated, documented, communicated broadly and widely, and that everybody in the BCDR and incident response areas is trained on those thought processes, is aware of them, and has agreed to be bound by them, so that we're not fixing the wrong thing at the wrong time. This is something that can often happen in organizations that don't forward think and forward plan through their BCDR, specifically the BC, and transition to DR processes, and they don't incorporate that business impact analysis as part of that thought process. So some critical things to consider there. Consistent backups for applications and data, whether it's snapshots for VMs, some sort of recovery services capabilities I mentioned, perhaps subscription limits. We have to worry about those because depending on the vendor, I try to keep it generic and not be specific to any one platform as I talk about these references. Again, the names may change between platforms. We may call it backup recovery services in one platform. It may be called something slightly different in another, but the concept is going to be the same. All the public cloud providers do have subscription limits based on how you onboard, the contractual agreements you engage in, and the commitments you make for spending. Recovery is often something I find in talking to customers that people overlook. They don't consider that as part of their subscription limits, and they don't, in other words, spend money to have failover capacity because they don't realize they need to, and it's a blind spot. And then they go to failover, they go to run additional workloads to spin things up, to mirror systems, et cetera, and they find out quickly they run into an issue where they don't have enough capacity or headroom in the platform. They have to stop what they're doing, get on with support, figure out how to extend those capabilities, right? The good thing about the cloud is it's burstable. The bad thing about the cloud is it's not always burstable on demand. That's a term we often use. Yes, you can make a request, you can put down a credit card, you can get into a queue and have someone say yes and they'll add that, but it could take minutes, it could take hours before that is processed, depending on the platform of the request. And in the meantime, you're stuck waiting and you can't do anything. And customers are not going to want to be told, we're sorry, but they're going to want to look elsewhere if you can't step up and service their needs pretty quickly. So keep that in mind. That's a big blind spot I find with many companies when I do work with them, that they often tend to miss that. Workload suitability for availability zones and or availability sets. Again, the names may vary by platform for this technology and this capability, but being able to move data and capabilities to deploy infrastructure both within a stack in a single data center, stack to stack, meaning rack to rack, but also zone within that area, and then geographically within the availability zones for that particular geography, and even more broadly, geographically distributed across the fabric globally if necessary. You have options, and you need to be aware of those options. You need to think through them. You need to make informed decisions. This is where, and I talked about this in one of our prior webinars, you may or may not have attended, but I know the recordings are available online. Peter, I'm sure will speak to that at the end of our time together to remind you about that. But in one of our earlier webinars this month, in our general theme, focusing around cloud and multi-cloud, I spoke about this role, the cloud security architect and cloud architect role that would be anchored in a center of excellence for cloud design in organizations. And I'm going to remind those of you that attended that webinar about that. Those of you that did not, I encourage you to watch the recording and do a little research, figure out more about setting up a cloud center of excellence, what we call CCOE, as well as finding and formally defining both a cloud security engineer and cloud architecture role in your organization. If you don't have one today, that's fine. You may not be big enough and need one, but there are roles out there that are predefined, and many organizations, both small, medium, and large, are not only seeking to actively find these people, but are hiring them even as a part-time consultant. And those people can help you stand up and right-size that thought process and that architecture and make those decisions. And they're going to play a significant part in helping you figure out the BCDR enigma right in this area. Network connectivity, planning for and unplanned failovers, All things I've talked about already, but very important. If we don't have bandwidth and we don't allocate bandwidth and have failover capacity in our bandwidth allocations, in our routing, our public IP ranges, in our site-to-site traffic routes and route tables and all those things that we think of, then those systems are going to become isolated. You're going to have islands that survive, but no bridges that allow you to connect them. And while that's good, those systems in those isolated areas are going to be able to come back online once you reestablish connectivity. The problem is you have no way to establish connectivity because you don't have the overhead and the capability to do so. Now you've got to work with your vendor. You've got to get on the phone probably with your several layers deep in your supply chain, because this may now be a function of your routers, and there may be third-party routers you're using that are physical, as well as virtual, right, routing infrastructure that's built into things like vCenter and VMware, for instance. And as a result, you may not just be using the physical infrastructure, right, is different from the built-in and provided routing infrastructure that the public cloud providers are going to spin up. If you've got hybrid environments that are linking to on-site areas, you're going to own those routers and those routes. You may be using dedicated fiber, things like express route connections that are spun up with third-party vendors. So there's a lot of complexity that has to be considered outside of just the public cloud provider as you bring in these additional areas. And challenging you to think about those is what I was really looking at as we wrap up our considerations conversation. It's time to convert some of those considerations into tangible takeaways, recommendations. I've spoken to some of these already, but things that you can do and should be doing. Things like employing site recovery for virtual machine workloads in DR scenarios. I talked a bit about that, and I've mentioned it already. Understanding how to use the capabilities of RPO and RTO to meet those requirements. But companies often fall short here because they don't think about and focus on running recovery drills without affecting production workloads. In other words, dry run and practice what's going to happen when you have to do this for real, and figure out how to avoid affecting production if possible, but make sure you know what buttons to push, what switches to pull, and or flick on and off, and what levers need to be available to which teams. This is a gray area sometimes. We don't have good role definition and team definition in terms of a RASI matrix, right? Responsibility, accountability, consulting, who's going to be told about what and who is going to be informed, right? Or who's going to be asked their opinion when we talk about the consulting in RASI, the C, and who's going to be told. And if we don't have a good understanding of who's in charge of what and who should be overseeing and maintaining documentation in these areas, we run into a situation where, unfortunately, nobody knows what to do and everyone is scared to make a decision. This may sound familiar to some of you. We want to avoid that, right? Especially in complex areas. Use native PaaS DR capabilities. Spoke a little bit about this as well. Ensure that you're leveraging the best of breed capabilities by cloud platform vendor. If Azure is really good at something and AWS is going to be good at something else, let's go with those strengths. If we're doing multi-cloud, let's not force Azure to be good at something it's not good at, but let's not rely on AWS for things that we know we can do better elsewhere, right? And this is going to be important for you to think about. Not every provider is good at everything, and you don't have a need for everything. This is also an area where I find companies tend to struggle a little bit. Prioritize what's important. What are the X number of services, application workloads, 5, 10, 20? I don't know what they are. That's going to be unique to you. But I can tell you that number exists for your organization, but you probably don't know what's on that list and what priority order they all need to be in. And if you haven't defined that, it's going to be really hard for you to understand where the best of breed tool set is for each of those needs. Start with the obvious. Work out from the workload and the capability you need to satisfy to ensure it will either stay online or come back online quickly in the face of BCDR activity, and then figure out how to optimize that and then design accordingly. That's the way that we do this, and that's the best practice that we want to really remind you of with these recommendations. Use native backup capabilities as well. Again, PaaS native capabilities are going to be important here, but there's third-party infrastructure that also may play a part. You may have workflow capabilities to do some of this with Terraform and infrastructure as code, for instance. Setting up and auditing and enforcing backup configurations through policy is going to be the way to scale this and manage this, because you have to bring a lot of pieces together. The good news is every one of those platforms we've been discussing all have this policy-based capability. You just have to figure out what it is and understand how to deploy it effectively. Again, training with companies like Cloud Institute, but also setting up that center of excellence and bringing those roles in-house. Cloud architect, cloud security engineer are going to help you to make those decisions and implement them properly. Using multiple regions and peering locations, as well as avoiding, and this is a big one in particular, the one on the bottom, avoiding using overlapping IP address ranges in production and DR networks. This is a gotcha that I've seen with many customers and students in courses over the decades that I've been spending time in this world. And if we fall prey to using overlapping IP addresses, we're going to have conflicts. There's going to be complications with application failover. Things may not work properly. There's going to be DNS, name resolution issues that have to be resolved, no pun intended. And there's going to be a lot of problems. You're going to make a bad situation that much worse by actually complicating things that should be straightforward, simple, and easy. So spend some time, execute the due diligence here, go back and check your IP ranges, make sure they are not overlapping. Very important. All right, so we've covered our considerations and our recommendations. I want to wrap up our conversations over the next 3 or 4 minutes here and then turn it back to Peter for questions and wrap up. Just hitting some highlights on some things. This graphic may look familiar to some of you. This is the NIST incident response workflow. And one of the questions we posed for this webinar are, what are the steps and tools to create and test a BCDR incident response plan in multi-cloud environments? I've mentioned architecting for failure. I mentioned identifying risks. These are all tied to the incident response workflow that NIST is providing, and that has become a standard globally for companies. And you should definitely be thinking, based on our conversation up until this point, about how to engage around those items, right? Very important there. In terms of selecting appropriate tools, creating a response plan, I've spoken about these things as well. Best of breed based on prioritization of workload and regulatory statutory alignment, going to be important there from an audit and a continuity perspective. Creating a response plan that is documented, that is broadly and widely communicated, that is tested on an ongoing basis, and that is updated as needed would fall into the category here of creating a response plan, just to broaden that conversation out for you a little bit. When we think about the last major area or item here, we want to think about testing our plan regularly to test, as I mentioned, and ensure effectiveness. Nothing says we're good and we like our plan and we're confident with it than a recently run test that shows that we can do exactly what the plan claims it should be able to do. How often, I get asked, how often should testing occur? How aggressive is too aggressive? You know, the industry standard is minimally once a year, but if you want to test every 6 months, more power to you. There's nothing wrong with that. By the way, if you're in a regulated industry like banking and financial services, you may have to test every 6 months. So be aware of those regulatory compliance issues and align with them. But you're safe and I think in a good spot if you're testing at least once a year. But it has to be a meaningful and full test, just to be clear about that. All right, as we wrap up, what are the benefits and challenges of BCDR in incident response in a multi-cloud environment? Benefits, as you can see, include things like improved availability. We talked about that, performance, scalability, and cost efficiency. Challenges are going to include the complexity that I've been prattling on about for the better part of the last 20 or so minutes. And of course, coordination and governance issues, as I mentioned. All of those are going to be problematic, and we want to make sure we're aware of those. The more due diligence and due care you bring to this, awareness of governance, risk management, and compliance is due diligence. How we implement and act to align with those and support them is due care. The more due diligence you bring to this conversation, the better off you're going to be. The more due care you bring through action that is aligned to support that due diligence, the more likely you are to avert catastrophe, minimize and mitigate risk, and maximize the positive impact of change in the organization, just to be clear. Speaking of risk, reminding you it's important to address cybersecurity risk. Very important for you to be able to do that. Cybersecurity and security management overall has become the single biggest critical issue for companies in and out of the cloud. Cloud amplifies that, as we see time and again. Global pandemics don't do anything to help that, right? So it's become a really big pressing issue, as is third-party risk management, extending through our supply chains as a result of that. So keep in mind the focus on cybersecurity risk, very important. Keep in mind the issues we mentioned already around poor visibility in multi-cloud environments. You need to be aware of how to address cross-platform tooling, as well as auditability and verification and validation through those vendors becomes critical. Working with the vendors and the tool sets they provide is the secret ingredient to success here. And then controlling costs, as I mentioned in some prior discussions, is going to be paramount for you to be able to survive and thrive in the cloud. The good news is every cloud provider platform has budgetary controls and costing estimation capabilities that you can use to analyze costs and to visualize them so you can understand what they are. And then finally, not having an exit strategy. I want to end with that. I think it's apropos and appropriate for lots of reasons, but I do find that companies that have thought about the cloud and have gotten into it, but haven't thought about what happens if we want to get out of it, tend to struggle and tend to have a lot of issues. And I spoke about this in other conversations, and it's an ongoing debate in our industry, but it is a topic I would challenge you as we get done wrapping up and really think through finishing my remarks as I get ready to turn it back to Peter. I would ask you to think about what your exit strategy is in the cloud, how your company is going to exit the cloud, maybe never, but what if you had to do it tomorrow for some reason? What would those steps be? And how would you get your data out and reestablish your workloads outside of the cloud? If you don't have answers to those questions, that's okay. But if you need answers and you don't have them, that's not okay. Think about that as we get ready to wrap up. And Peter, I just want to quickly throw out my LinkedIn information for a minute. If anybody wants to connect with me, I encourage you all to do so. Let me throw it back to Peter, bring him back in, and welcome him back to the end of our conversation. And Peter, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And yeah, that was great stuff. And we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So let's take a look at those. You mentioned backups at one point. Do you have any best practices that you can share for backups? That was asked.
Sure. You know, the nice thing about backups, right, is that just like backups in the old world, right? When I say old world, I mean prior to cloud. So full on premises, right? Kind of old school way of doing this. You'd have some sort of backup software, right? Or you'd have a backup capability. Maybe it was a hardware appliance, whatever it would have been. You would have run it on premise. You would have swapped out tapes and or created network shares and stored those backups. And while we're not swapping out tapes, right, in the cloud today, we are doing this on the wire, over the wire, with back-end infrastructure the public cloud provider is giving us access to. We are moving the same bits and we are archiving them somewhere and keeping them for a rainy day, right? The process, in other words, has not changed. So from a best practice perspective, several things come to mind. First of all, understand the data that is being backed up. How much of it is necessary? How much of it is garbage, right? We all know those people in organizations that have a mailbox that goes back decades and that is bigger than anything we've ever seen and that we can't logically back up because it's just too big. And 3/4 of that information is probably no longer relevant, but they refuse to get rid of it. So I always counsel customers to prioritize, but also to sanitize, right? In the sense of understanding what is relevant to their needs to manage data. And don't be afraid to get rid of stuff, but do so in a logical and smart way. Deep storage and archiving for data that's not required normally, but may be required as a point in time reference for audits and things like that is perfectly acceptable. You should engage and think about engaging around those activities. Streamline and cut down the amount of active data being backed up is probably the best thing we can tell you to do from an optimization standpoint, because it's going to speed up the time to finish the backups. It's going to allow you to do integrity verification more readily on them. It's going to allow you to speed up the time to restore when you have to use those backups, break that glass, and actually deploy them. All of those things are dependent on the volume of information. The more data you back up, the longer it takes. And the longer it takes in a disaster situation, the more likely it is that you're going to fail. That's just the reality of how things work. So probably that's going to be the best thing off the top of my head. And then, of course, find a vendor that's going to offer the services you need, right? Don't pay for stuff you don't need, even though it sounds good and it's flashy. Pay for the stuff you need that you can use and find a vendor that's willing to work with you on that.
I feel like we just saw a lot of that too in Las Vegas, where one company said we're going to pay the ransom, the other said we're going to restore from backups, and it took a few days.
Yeah, Caesars decided to pay. MGM decided they were going to. Well, they're still deciding how to figure it out, right? They haven't figured it out yet, but they at least as far as we know today have not decided to pay, and they're losing a lot of money as a result, day by day.
And unfortunately, none of them are watching this webinar, as I can see. So
go figure.
It would have helped. One more real quick one, just a definition thing. Someone asked, you mentioned a zero trust model. They've heard that term before, but aren't exactly sure. So can you kind of give us a quick explanation of that?
Absolutely. So zero trust is become a real popular talking point in our industry. And a lot of people think it's a brand new thing. So it's actually not a brand new thing. It's been around for a very long time. What's happened to popularize it in the last couple of years is that NIST wrote up their version of what zero trust models and architecture should look like. NIST SP 800-207 is the document that you want to look at there. And depending on what happens with the budget and the government shutdown rumors in the US, you might want to go get a copy of that sooner rather than later, because this may be going offline at the end of this week, because they are a US funded government entity. And if there's no money in the budget for a couple of days, NIST unfortunately shuts down, those websites become unavailable. But NIST SP 800-207 is the reference document for Zero Trust model and architecture. So start there, those of you that want to clarify and understand more about it. But what Zero Trust really is, quite honestly, is a reimagining, a rebranding, if you will, right? Marketing, right? Speak for a technology architecture that we have had and thought about in our industry for decades, which is essentially trust nobody and validate everything. That's really when we summarize what Zero Trust is. We get right down to it. We say, the idea of Zero Trust is the idea of not allowing us to have hardened boundaries that incorporate huge areas of internal, right? We're talking about LAN, local area network versus WAN, external, right? Markers. So think about an imaginary line or boundary that surrounds your organization globally. Everything inside that boundary would be considered the local area network, even if it's a globally extended LAN, but it's private LAN. Zero Trust says, well, you know what? Normally, right, until we think about Zero Trust, we would say everything inside that boundary is trusted at some level and would be given a certain predetermined level of baseline access without us having to challenge those people, those workloads, those service accounts beyond the initial logon. We will accept that they are who they say they are, and we'll let them through and give them whatever they're supposed to have. Zero Trust says, hey, hold on, wait a second. We're not comfortable doing that. This is a pretty big area you're defining inside this boundary on this thing you call a LAN. We know there's bad people outside that boundary on the WAN. We think there may be bad actors inside on the LAN. We just don't know who they are. So we're going to assume everybody's equally guilty until you prove that you shouldn't be considered guilty, is what Zero Trust says. Not that we think you're up to no good, but rather we want you to prove that you're not so we can allow you to do your job. And Zero Trust implies, and indeed comes right out and says, trust nobody, authenticate every request and every resource, and ongoing, not just once. That's the mistake people make, and that's the break from the past. Let's not authenticate them once and then forget about them. Let's authenticate them ongoing as they ask for access. Let's every 20 minutes or whatever that marker in time is, let's re-authenticate that user. We have this in secure government networks with CAT cards, right? In military and government, you leave that card in the reader whenever you want to be on that system. The second you remove that card, and this is not just in government, it's in private sector as well, that card comes out of the reader, your access card, to authenticate you continuously. That session is cut off and that resource goes dark. And that's an example of the kind of thing we think of with Zero Trust. So a little bit of a high level there. There's a lot of additional detail, right? Obviously, we talk about creating enclaves and micro environments that we can then really facilitate authentication and inspection around for highly prized resources versus other things that we're essentially going to just let go. So there's a lot more to this conversation, but check out the documentation. Take a look at the NIST document, gives you a good overview, and then come on back and chat with Peter and the guys here over at Cloud Institute. They can help give you a lot of guidance on that, and it'll be a lot of fun for you to learn how to do it.
Yeah, that could certainly be its own webinar, just to getting into Zero Trust and that model and best practices. So maybe one for the future there. But hey, before we let you go, we want to be respectful of all your time. Want to let you know about a couple of things going on at Cloud Institute. So we have our Microsoft Azure Bootcamp. It's a great place to get started if you're going down that route. Prepares you to earn the 3 most in-demand Azure certs, the fundamentals, administrator, and solutions architect, and also has 2 hours of personalized coaching with an Azure expert, self-paced courses, demos, and hands-on labs. We also have similar boot camps for Google Cloud and AWS as well. But I'll share that link in the chat here now. And also, if you're not sure where to start, we strongly advise getting advice from a personal cloud coach. So if you subscribe to our monthly or annual coaching, you get access to our full library of training at or N labs at no additional cost. So that starts at just $64 a month. And that's the way to go if you're really serious about advancing and getting going there. So Adam, before we let you go, any closing thoughts?
Just don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Don't be afraid to, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, to reach out for help if you don't have those skill sets. And there's absolutely no shame in not having them on staff for any number of reasons. But there is liability in knowing that you have a gap and not addressing it, right? So get help, even if it means you have to go outside of your initial comfort zone. Get the trusted resources, ask peers, colleagues, get professional advice on who's trustworthy, engage with those professionals, and ask tough questions. Make them justify the recommendations they're giving you, and make informed decisions. That's the most important thing you can do.
Definitely. All right. Well, please send us a message if you'd like to be notified of other upcoming events we have. We're always hosting these kinds of free trainings. The next one, I know we will have one in early October. Right now, we've got one scheduled in late October that is with a guy named FK, who's the CTO at Cloud Institute. He's going to be talking about some of the AWS services and introing some of that cloud architecture. That's Wednesday, October 25th. So watch out on the LinkedIn page for that information. And Adam, we just had one question pop up. They asked where they could find that NIST doc. So you said it's just on the NIST website?
So they would go to the NIST website. NIST has several different categories. They're very broad. They have documentation, guidance around all sorts of stuff. You are looking at the SPSP. Sierra Papa stands for Special Publications. So SP 800 is the designator for the series on information security, along with 1500. We're in the 800 series in this case, 800-207. So NIST SP 800-207. That's what you want to Google for or search for, and you will find that document. Again, no pressure, but if NIST decides to roll up shop at the end of the week because of the budget issues at the Capitol, you want to try to get out there sooner rather than later. Grab a copy of that. It is free. All the NIST documentation is. You just have to go download it from the website.
Awesome. Thanks for that question, Lewis. And thank you, Adam, so much for participating with us today. Thanks all of you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Absolutely. And hey, Lewis, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. Lewis is a buddy of mine. So good to see you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, everyone.